Among the Ruins. New York, 1917. Margaret Hayes nearly tossed the crumpled telegram she found on her doorstep until she saw the name. Sergeant Henry Whitaker. But the message wasn't addressed to her. He's still alive. Stop looking. The sender? Unknown. Chapter 1. The telegram that wasn't meant for her. The wind, a cruel mimic of the sea she'd left behind in Ireland years ago, whipped at Margaret Hayes's skirts as she bent to retrieve the crumpled paper from her brownstone stoop. It was a damp, gray morning in New York, 1917, the kind that clung to your bones and whispered of sorrows yet to come. The city, usually a cacophony of clanging trolleys and hawkers' cries, felt muted, subdued by the ever-present shadow of the war raging across the Atlantic. Margaret almost tossed the telegram into the overflowing bin beside the door. Junk mail, most likely. Another plea for war bonds, another thinly veiled advertisement masquerading as patriotic duty. She'd become adept at spotting them, at discarding them before the carefully crafted words could worm their way into her already fractured heart. But something, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, made her pause. A name, scrawled in hurried ink, caught the weak morning light. Sergeant Henry Whitaker. Her breath hitched. Her fingers, roughened by years of factory work and the endless scrubbing of floors, tightened around the thin paper.
Henry. It couldn't be.
He was gone.
Lost.
Swallowed by the insatiable maw of the trenches, just like so many others. The official letter, stark and impersonal, had arrived months ago, delivered by a grim-faced boy barely old enough to shave. She'd memorized the words, each syllable a hammer blow to her soul, missing in action. Presumed deceased. She smoothed the crumpled telegram, her heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. The message was brief, stark, and utterly baffling. He's still alive. Stop looking. The sender? Unknown. Margaret stared at the words, her mind reeling. It was addressed to a Miss Eleanor Ainsworth, at an address a few blocks away, a wealthier neighborhood of manicured lawns and gleaming brass door knockers. A neighborhood Margaret only saw when she was delivering laundry, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the cracked pavement. Who was Eleanor Ainsworth? And why was she looking for Henry? The questions clawed at her, sharp and insistent. Logic told her to discard the telegram, to deliver it to its rightful recipient, to forget she'd ever seen it. Henry was gone. She'd mourned him, buried him in the quiet cemetery of her heart. To reopen that wound, to entertain even the faintest glimmer of hope, was madness. But the name Henry Whitaker, the way the ink bled slightly on the cheap paper, as if written in haste, in desperation. It was a phantom hand reaching out from the grave, beckoning her. Margaret had loved Henry Whitaker with the fierce, unwavering devotion of a woman who had found solace in his quiet strength, in his gentle smile, in the way his eyes, the color of warm honey, had held hers across the crowded dance floor of a Lower East Side social hall. They had met 2 years ago, a whirlwind romance amidst the rising tide of war fever. He was a carpenter, skilled with his hands, building a life for himself in this new world. She was a seamstress, her nimble fingers stitching together dreams of a future that now felt as fragile as cobwebs. He'd enlisted, of course. Duty called, the newspapers proclaimed. He'd promised to come back. He'd held her close, his breath warm against her ear, and whispered, "Wait for me, Maggie. I'll come back." She'd waited. She'd prayed. She'd clung to his letters, each one a precious lifeline, until they stopped coming.
Now this
cruel, impossible message. Margaret looked up at the gray sky, the wind whipping her hair around her face. She felt a familiar ache in her chest, a hollow space where hope used to reside. She'd learned to live with it, to carry it like a heavy stone, a constant reminder of her loss. But this telegram, it was a crack in the carefully constructed wall she'd built around her heart. She thought of the Eleanor Ainsworth, living a few streets away, and she hated her. She had no right to look for a dead man. Margaret's dead man. A sudden, fierce surge of defiance coursed through her. She wouldn't deliver the telegram. Not yet.
She needed to know.
She needed to understand. The official letter, the months of silence, the hollow ache in her heart, it all suddenly felt like a lie. A carefully constructed deception. But who would lie about something like this?
And why?
The questions swirled around her, unanswered, unsettling. She glanced at the address again. Miss Eleanor Ainsworth. She pictured a woman, elegant and refined, her hands unmarred by labor, her life untouched by the harsh realities of Margaret's world. A woman who, for some unknown reason, was searching for a man who was supposed to be dead. Margaret made a decision. She wouldn't go to the factory today. She wouldn't spend another day hunched over a sewing machine, her fingers bleeding, her heart numb. She would follow this thread, this fragile, impossible hope, and see where it led. Even if it led to more pain, more heartbreak. She had to know. She carefully folded the telegram and tucked it into the pocket of her worn coat. The paper felt warm against her skin, a secret she was carrying, a burden she was choosing to bear. As she walked away from her brownstone, leaving behind the familiar smells of coal smoke and stale bread, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months. Not hope, not yet, but something akin to it. A spark of defiance, a refusal to accept the fate that had been dealt to her. A determination to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The wind continued to whip around her, but she no longer felt its chill. She was walking towards an unknown future, armed with a crumpled telegram and a heart that was, against all odds, starting to beat again. The name on that telegram was a ghost she needed to find. She just needed to know if that ghost was truly still alive. And why someone was trying to keep them apart. Chapter 2. Whispers on the Docks. The walk to the Ainsworth residence was a journey through shifting landscapes, both physical and social. Margaret moved from the cramped, bustling streets of her immigrant neighborhood, where the air thrummed with the mingled scents of garlic, cabbage, and coal smoke, to the wide, tree-lined avenues of the wealthy. Here, the houses were grander, the windows cleaner, the silence deeper, broken only by the occasional rumble of a passing motor car or the clipped tones of a governess scolding her charges. Margaret felt increasingly out of place, her worn coat and scuffed boots a stark contrast to the elegant attire of the women she passed on the street. She clutched the telegram in her pocket, its presence a constant reminder of her purpose, a shield against the judging eyes that seemed to follow her every step. The Ainsworth house was a formidable structure of gray stone, with a wrought iron gate and a meticulously manicured lawn. Margaret hesitated at the gate, her hand hovering over the cold metal. Doubt gnawed at her. What if she was wrong? What if this was all a cruel mistake, a clerical error, a twisted coincidence? She almost turned back, almost surrendered to the familiar comfort of her grief. But the image of Henry's face, his warm smile, his honey-colored eyes, flashed before her. She remembered the feel of his hand in hers, the strength of his embrace, the whispered promises he'd made. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the gate and walked up the stone path. The sound of her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. She reached the imposing front door, with its gleaming brass knocker shaped like a lion's head, and hesitated again. Before she could knock, the door swung open. A woman stood there, framed by the dimly lit interior. She was older than Margaret had expected, perhaps in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a severe expression. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore a simple but elegant black dress. This was not the young, carefree woman Margaret had imagined. Yes. The woman's voice was crisp, her tone unwelcoming. Margaret swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. I have a telegram for Miss Eleanor Ainsworth. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. I am Eleanor Ainsworth.
Give it to me.
Margaret hesitated. She hadn't planned this far. She'd assumed she would be speaking to a younger woman, a contemporary of Henry's. This was different. It was delivered to my address by mistake, Margaret stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I saw the name. Eleanor Ainsworth's expression didn't change. The name? Sergeant Henry Whitaker, Margaret said, the name catching in her throat. A flicker of something surprise, perhaps, or even fear crossed the older woman's face, but it was gone so quickly that Margaret almost thought she'd imagined it. "Give me the telegram," Eleanor Ainsworth repeated, her voice sharper now. Margaret slowly pulled the crumpled paper from her pocket and handed it over. The woman snatched it from her grasp, her fingers brushing Margaret's. They were cold, like ice. Eleanor Ainsworth unfolded the telegram and scanned its contents. Her face remained impassive, but Margaret noticed a slight tremor in her hand.
"Who are you?"
The woman asked abruptly, her eyes fixed on Margaret. "Margaret Hayes," she replied, her voice steadier now. I knew Henry." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Knew him?
"How?"
Margaret hesitated. How could she explain the depth of her love, the pain of her loss, to this cold, forbidding woman? We were to be married," she said finally, the words a painful admission. Eleanor Ainsworth stared at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped aside and gestured for Margaret to enter. "Come in, Miss Hayes. We have much to discuss." Margaret hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to flee. But the lure of the unknown, the desperate need to understand, was too strong to resist. She stepped across the threshold, into the dimly lit hallway of the Ainsworth house, and into a world of secrets and lies. The house was as grand and imposing as its exterior suggested. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and heavy, ornate furniture filled the space. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old money. It was a world away from Margaret's cramped tenement apartment. Eleanor Ainsworth led her into a small, sparsely furnished parlor. The only light came from a single window, which overlooked a walled garden. The silence was heavy, oppressive. "Sit down, Miss Hayes," Eleanor Ainsworth said, gesturing to a stiff-backed chair. Margaret sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She felt like an intruder, a trespasser in this alien world. Eleanor Ainsworth remained standing, her back to the window, her face in shadow. "You say you were to be married to Henry," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "He never mentioned you." The words were like a slap in the face. Margaret felt a surge of anger, of betrayal. "He wrote to me," she said, her voice trembling. "He sent me letters." Until he was reported missing," Eleanor Ainsworth finished, her voice still cold. "Yes, I know. I received the same news." Margaret stared at her, confused. You received the news? But who are you?" Eleanor Ainsworth took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I am Henry's aunt," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "His mother's sister." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Henry's aunt. He'd never mentioned an aunt. He'd spoken of his parents, of his childhood in England, but never of an aunt in New York. I don't understand," Margaret stammered. Why didn't he tell me?" Eleanor Ainsworth turned away, her gaze fixed on the garden outside. "Henry had his reasons," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Reasons that are not mine to share." "But the telegram," Margaret said, her voice rising in desperation. "It says he's alive. It says to stop looking. Why would someone send that?" Eleanor Ainsworth turned back to face her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation.
"I don't know," she said.
I prayed it was true." But she trailed off, her voice choked with emotion. Margaret saw, for the first time, a flicker of vulnerability in the woman's eyes. She saw the pain of a woman who had lost a loved one, just like she had. "I've been searching for him," Eleanor Ainsworth continued, her voice barely audible. "I've contacted everyone I could think of. I've spent a fortune on private investigators. But there's been nothing."
"No trace."
Until this, she gestured to the telegram, which lay on a small table between them.
"I don't know who sent it or why.
But I know one thing. It's a lie. Henry is gone." Her words, though soft, seemed to resonate with a finality that crushed Margaret's rekindled hope. But something still felt off. "But if you thought he was gone, why look on the docks? Why send someone there?" "I overheard a conversation near the shipping lines." About a man, fitting Henry's description. Someone was asking. Eleanor's eyes widened, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. Who? Who was asking? The intensity of her gaze made Margaret take a step back. The air felt suddenly heavy, the silence in the room punctuated only by the distant ticking of a clock. This woman, Henry's aunt, was hiding something. Something significant. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Ellis Island. Margaret shifted uneasily under Eleanor's intense scrutiny. It was just a couple of men, rough-looking. Dockworkers, I think. They were talking about someone who'd arrived recently. A soldier. They mentioned a scar. Above his left eye. Henry had a scar above his left eye. A childhood accident, he told her, a clumsy fall from a tree. He'd always been self-conscious about it, brushing his hair forward to conceal it. Eleanor's face paled. A scar, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Did they say anything else? Just that he was asking questions. About someone named Ainsworth. Margaret hesitated, watching Eleanor carefully. He seemed lost, confused. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, her hand going to her throat as if she were struggling to breathe. When she opened them again, they were filled with a desperate, haunted look. He's alive, she whispered, more to herself than to Margaret. He's alive, and he's looking for me. Margaret felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by a wave of confusion. But you said you thought he was gone. Eleanor shook her head, her gaze distant. I had to believe it. For his safety. His safety? Margaret's voice rose in disbelief. What are you talking about? Who would want to harm Henry? Eleanor looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. There are things you don't understand, Miss Hayes. Things about Henry's past, about my family, that are best left buried. Buried? Margaret exclaimed. But he's alive. He's here in New York, looking for you. How can you say that's best left buried? Eleanor walked to the window, her back to Margaret. Henry is not who you think he is, she said, her voice low and strained. He's not just a carpenter, a soldier. He's something more. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? Eleanor turned back to face her, her expression grim. Before he enlisted, Henry was working for me. Doing dangerous work. Dangerous work? Margaret repeated, her mind racing. What kind of work? Eleanor hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. I'm involved in certain activities, she said vaguely. Activities that are not entirely legal. Activities that have made me enemies. Margaret stared at her, aghast. You mean, you're a criminal? Eleanor gave a wry smile. Let's just say I operate in a gray area. I help people. People who need to disappear. People who need to start new lives. And Henry, he helped you with this? Eleanor nodded. He was good at it. He was quick, resourceful, and he could blend in anywhere. He had a natural talent for deception. The word hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Deception. Margaret thought of Henry's gentle smile, his honest eyes, his unwavering love. Could he have been deceiving her all along? But why would he need to disappear? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Why would he be in danger? Because he knew too much, Eleanor said simply. He knew about my operation, about my contacts, about the people I've helped. And some of those people, they wouldn't hesitate to kill him to keep him silent. Margaret felt a wave of nausea. She couldn't reconcile this image of Henry, the spy, the deceiver, with the man she had loved. But the telegram, Margaret said, grasping at straws. It said to stop looking. Who would send that? Eleanor's face hardened. Someone who wants him to stay hidden. Someone who knows that if he's found, he'll be killed. But who? Margaret persisted. Was it one of your enemies? Eleanor shook her head. I don't think so. They would have killed him already. No, this is someone else. Someone who's protecting him. Protecting him? By keeping him hidden? By keeping him away from me? Margaret's voice rose in anger. That's not protection. That's torture. Eleanor looked at her, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. I know it's hard, Miss Hayes. But you have to understand. Henry's life is at stake. If he's found, he'll be killed. And if you continue to look for him, you'll be putting yourself in danger as well. Margaret stared at her, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to believe. Was Eleanor telling the truth? Was Henry really in danger? Or was this all an elaborate lie, a way to keep her away from him? I need to see him, Margaret said, her voice firm. I need to see him for myself. I need to know the truth. Eleanor shook her head. That's impossible. I don't know where he is. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. It's too dangerous. Then I'll find him myself, Margaret declared, her resolve hardening. I won't stop looking. Not until I know the truth. Eleanor sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. You're a stubborn woman, Miss Hayes. Just like Henry. Where should I look? Margaret pressed. The docks? The men mentioned Ellis Island, that he was asking about transport, papers. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. Ellis Island? He wouldn't be that foolish. But her voice lacked conviction. Ellis Island, the gateway to America, the place where millions of immigrants had passed through, hoping for a new life. It was also a place of anonymity, of lost identities, of secrets. A perfect place for someone who wanted to disappear. I have to go, Margaret said, rising to her feet. I have to find him. Eleanor didn't try to stop her. She simply looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. Be careful, Miss Hayes, she said softly. The world is a dangerous place, and some secrets are best left buried. Margaret didn't reply. She turned and walked out of the parlor, out of the Ainsworth house, and back into the gray, uncertain morning. The telegram, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a curse, a lead weight in her pocket. She knew that she was stepping into a world of shadows and lies, a world where nothing was as it seemed. But she couldn't turn back. She had to find Henry, even if it meant risking everything. Even if it meant facing the truth about the man she thought she knew. Ellis Island. The ghost of Henry Whitaker was there. She could feel it. And she would find him, no matter the cost. The echoing silence of the grand house seemed to follow her, a silent warning of the dangers ahead. But Margaret pressed on, driven by a love that refused to be extinguished, a love that demanded answers. Chapter 4. A Passage to France. The ferry to Ellis Island churned through the choppy waters of New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty a distant, melancholic figure in the misty morning. Margaret stood at the railing, her gaze fixed on the sprawling complex of buildings ahead. The air was thick with the smell of salt water and coal smoke, and the cries of gulls mingled with the rumble of the engine. She felt a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Ellis Island. A place of hope and despair, of new beginnings and shattered dreams. She'd been there once before, years ago, when she'd first arrived from Ireland. She remembered the overwhelming feeling of disorientation, the fear of the unknown, the desperate hope for a better life. Now, she was returning, not as an immigrant seeking entry, but as a woman searching for a ghost. A ghost who might be hiding in plain sight, amidst the throngs of newcomers and the watchful eyes of immigration officials. She clutched the small, worn photograph of Henry she'd tucked into her pocket, her fingers tracing the outline of his face. It was the only physical reminder she had of him, a tangible link to the life they'd planned together. She'd stared at it countless times, memorizing every detail, every line, every shadow. It was a talisman, a source of strength in her darkest hours. As the ferry docked, Margaret joined the stream of passengers disembarking onto the island. The scene was chaotic, a swirling mass of humanity speaking a dozen different languages. Families huddled together, clutching their meager belongings, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Immigration officials barked orders, their voices amplified by megaphones. Margaret felt a surge of panic. How would she ever find Henry in this crowd? It was like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. She decided to start with the main building, the registry room, where immigrants were processed and examined. She pushed her way through the throng, her eyes scanning the faces around her. She looked for his familiar features, his honey-colored eyes, the scar above his left eyebrow. But every face was a stranger, a blur of unfamiliar features. She spent hours wandering through the building, asking questions, showing Henry's photograph to anyone who would listen. She spoke to officials, to guards, to interpreters, to fellow immigrants. But no one recognized him. No one had seen a man matching his description. Discouragement began to set in. Eleanor's words echoed in her mind. He's not who you think he is. He's good at deception. Was it possible that she'd been chasing a phantom all along? That Henry had never intended to come back to her? She found a quiet corner in the vast, echoing hall and sat down on a wooden bench, her head in her hands. The noise and chaos of the island swirled around her, but she felt utterly alone. A gentle hand touched her shoulder. She looked up, startled. An elderly woman stood beside her, her face wrinkled and kind, her eyes filled with compassion. "Are you all right, child?" the woman asked, her voice thick with an Eastern European accent. Margaret shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm looking for someone," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "A man. He might be here." The woman sat down beside her. "Who is he? What does he look like?" Margaret pulled out the photograph of Henry and showed it to the woman. "His name is Henry Whitaker," she said. "He's a soldier. He was reported missing in the war." The woman studied the photograph carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. I don't know," she said slowly. "But there's a man, he works here. He helps people. He might know something." Margaret's heart leaped with a flicker of hope. "Who is he? Where can I find him?" "His name is Samuel," the woman said. "He's a runner. He helps people get messages, find information. He knows everyone on the island. Where can I find him?" Margaret repeated, her voice urgent. "He's usually near the ferry docks," the woman said. "He wears a red scarf. You can't miss him." Margaret thanked the woman profusely and hurried back towards the docks. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the island. The crowds had thinned, and the air was cooler now. She spotted him almost immediately. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with a lean, wiry build and a shock of dark hair. He wore a bright red scarf around his neck, a splash of color against the drab surroundings. She approached him cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. "Are you Samuel?" she asked. The young man looked at her, his eyes wary. "Who wants to know?" Margaret hesitated. She didn't want to reveal too much, not yet. "I was told you might be able to help me," she said. "I'm looking for someone." "I help people find things," Samuel said, his voice noncommittal. "Information. Messages. Sometimes people." "I'm looking for a man," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "His name is Henry Whitaker. He's a soldier." Samuel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Whitaker," he repeated, as if testing the name on his tongue. "I've heard that name." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "You have? Where? When?" Samuel hesitated, his gaze darting around the docks. "It's not safe to talk here," he said. "Too many ears." He gestured towards a small, dilapidated building near the water's edge. "Meet me there. In 1 hour." Margaret nodded, her heart racing. She watched as Samuel disappeared into the crowd, the red scarf a fleeting beacon in the gathering dusk. An hour. An hour that felt like an eternity. She paced restlessly along the docks, her mind racing with possibilities. Samuel knew something. He'd heard Henry's name. But was it good news or bad? Was Henry alive and well, or was she walking into a trap? The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The lights of the city flickered on, a distant, shimmering constellation. Margaret made her way to the dilapidated building, her heart pounding in her chest. The building was dark and silent, its windows boarded up, its door hanging precariously on its hinges. She hesitated at the entrance, her hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. She had a sudden, overwhelming feeling of dread. She was stepping into the unknown, into a world of shadows and secrets. But she couldn't turn back. She had to know the truth, even if it meant risking everything. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the darkness swallowing her whole. She thought she heard the click of a lock behind her. The smell of salt and decay filled her nostrils. And then a voice. Looking for someone, Miss Hayes? It wasn't Samuel. Chapter 5. The Nurse with Secrets. The voice, smooth and laced with a faint, unplaceable accent, sent a shiver of fear down Margaret's spine. She spun around, her eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, slowly, deliberately. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the dim light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows.
Who are you?
Margaret demanded, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound brave. Where's Samuel? The man chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent another wave of unease through her. Samuel is indisposed. He won't be joining us. Margaret's hand instinctively went to her pocket, where she clutched the photograph of Henry. She felt a surge of anger, of defiance. What have you done with him? Nothing that concerns you, the man replied. I'm here to talk about Henry Whittaker. Margaret's heart leaped. You know him? You know where he is? Let's just say I'm acquainted with Mr. Whittaker, the man said. And I know that you've been looking for him. He's alive, Margaret said, her voice a mixture of hope and desperation.
Tell me he's alive.
The man stepped closer, and Margaret could finally make out his features. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps in his late 40s, with a stern, weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He wore a dark, nondescript suit that looked expensive but worn. He had an air of authority, of someone used to being obeyed. He's alive, the man confirmed, his voice flat.
For now.
Margaret felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a surge of suspicion.
For now?
What does that mean? It means his life is in danger, the man said. And you, Miss Hayes, are making it worse.
Me?
Margaret exclaimed.
How?
By asking questions, the man said. By digging into things that are best left buried. You're attracting attention. Unwanted attention. Margaret remembered Eleanor's words. You'll be putting yourself in danger as well. She felt a knot of fear tightening in her stomach.
Who are you?
Margaret repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Are you one of Eleanor's enemies? The man smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. Eleanor has many enemies, Miss Hayes. But I'm not one of them. I'm a friend. Of sorts. A friend who locks people in abandoned buildings? Margaret challenged, her fear giving way to anger. A necessary precaution, the man said. I need to know that I can trust you. That you won't betray Henry. Betray him? Margaret scoffed. I love him. I would never betray him. The man studied her for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes seeming to see right through her. Love is a powerful emotion, Miss Hayes. But it can also be a weakness. A liability. What do you want? Margaret asked, her voice shaking. I want you to stop looking for Henry, the man said bluntly. I want you to go back to your life. To forget you ever met him. Margaret stared at him, aghast. Never. I won't abandon him. The man sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. I was afraid you'd say that. You're as stubborn as he is. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. This is a message. From Henry. Margaret's heart leaped. She reached for the paper, her fingers trembling. The man held it just out of her reach. Before I give you this, he said, I need your word. That you'll do as I ask. That you'll leave Henry alone. Margaret hesitated. She desperately wanted to see the message, to hear from Henry, even if it was just a few words on a piece of paper. But she couldn't bring herself to make that promise. I can't, she said, her voice choked with emotion. The man's expression hardened. Then you leave me no choice. He turned to leave, the message still clutched in his hand.
Wait,
Margaret cried.
Please.
Just tell me, is he safe? The man paused at the door, his back to her. He's safer without you, he said coldly. The sooner you accept that, the better. He slipped out the door, leaving Margaret alone in the darkness. She heard the click of the lock again, and a wave of despair washed over her. She was trapped, both physically and emotionally. She sank to the floor, her head in her hands, and wept. She wept for Henry, for herself, for the lost dreams, for the uncertain future. She wept for the love that had brought her to this dark, desolate place. After a long while, her tears subsided, leaving her with a hollow ache in her chest. She sat up, her back against the cold, damp wall, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The man he'd said he was a friend of Henry's. But he'd also said that Henry was in danger, and that she was making it worse. He'd wanted her to stop looking for him, to forget him.
But why?
Why would a friend want to keep them apart? Unless he wasn't a friend at all. Unless he was someone who wanted Henry to disappear, someone who wanted to keep him hidden. Margaret thought of Eleanor, of her secrets, of her dangerous work. Could this man be connected to her? Could he be one of her enemies after all? Or was he telling the truth? Was Henry really safer without her? Was her love for him a danger, a liability? She didn't know what to believe. She felt lost, confused, and utterly alone. A faint sound caught her attention. A scratching, scraping noise coming from one of the boarded-up windows. She held her breath, listening intently. The scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. Then, a crack appeared in one of the boards, and a sliver of light pierced the darkness. Margaret scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. Someone was trying to get in. The board gave way with a loud crack, and a figure tumbled into the room. Margaret gasped. It was a woman, young and slender, with a mass of dark, curly hair. She wore a nurse's uniform, stained and torn, and her face was smudged with dirt. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were bright and alert. "Are you Margaret Hayes?" the woman asked, her voice breathless. Margaret nodded, dumbfounded. "I'm Clara," the woman said. "I'm a friend of Henry's. He sent me to find you." Relief flooded Margaret, so intense it almost brought her to her knees. Henry! He was alive, and he hadn't forgotten her. He'd sent someone to find her. But Clara's next words changed everything. "We have to get out of here.
Now."
They know you're here. And they're coming." The urgency in her voice sent a fresh wave of fear through Margaret.
Who were they?
And why were they so determined to keep her from Henry? Chapter 6. The Wounded Soldier's Plea. Clara pulled Margaret towards the broken window, her movements urgent and efficient. "There's no time to explain," she said, her voice low and hurried. "We have to go." Margaret didn't hesitate. She followed Clara through the narrow opening, scraping her arm on the splintered wood. They found themselves in a narrow alleyway, shrouded in darkness. The air was thick with the smell of garbage and decay. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked, struggling to keep up with Clara's brisk pace. "Somewhere safe," Clara replied. "Somewhere they won't find us." They ran through the labyrinthine alleyways, their footsteps echoing in the silence. Margaret's lungs burned, and her legs ached, but she didn't dare slow down. The fear of being caught, of being separated from Henry again, spurred her on. Clara seemed to know the area well, navigating the maze of narrow streets and hidden passageways with ease. She was clearly accustomed to moving in the shadows, to avoiding detection. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small, nondescript building tucked away on a quiet side street. Clara produced a key from her pocket and unlocked the door, ushering Margaret inside. They found themselves in a dimly lit room, sparsely furnished with a cot, a table, and a couple of chairs. The air was stale and musty, but it felt safe, a refuge from the danger outside. Clara closed and bolted the door, then turned to Margaret, her face etched with concern. "Are you all right?"
she asked.
Margaret nodded, her breath still coming in ragged gasps.
"Who are they?" she asked.
"Who's after us?" Clara hesitated, her gaze darting around the room as if she were afraid of being overheard. "It's complicated," she said. "There are people, powerful people, who want Henry silenced." "Silenced?" Margaret repeated, her voice trembling.
"Why?" "He knows too much," Clara said.
"He saw things, he heard things that he shouldn't have. Things that could put a lot of people in danger." Margaret remembered Eleanor's words. The mysterious man at Ellis Island. It all started to make a terrifying kind of sense. Henry was caught in a web of intrigue, of secrets and lies, that was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But why me? Margaret asked. Why are they after me? Because you're close to him, Clara said simply. They think you know something, or that you can lead them to him. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She was a pawn in a deadly game, a game she didn't even understand. Where is Henry? Margaret asked, her voice filled with desperation. Is he safe? Clara nodded. He's safe.
For now.
He's hiding. But he wants to see you.
He needs to see you.
Margaret's heart leaped with hope. Can you take me to him? Clara hesitated. It's risky. Very risky. They're watching you. They're watching everyone who's connected to him. I don't care, Margaret said fiercely. I have to see him. I have to know the truth. Clara studied her for a long moment, her eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. You're brave, Margaret. Just like Henry. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper.
This is from Henry, she said. He wrote it for you.
Margaret took the paper, her fingers trembling. It was the same paper the man at Ellis Island had offered her, the message she'd refused to bargain for. She unfolded the paper and read the words, written in Henry's familiar handwriting. My dearest Maggie, if you're reading this, it means Clara has found you. I'm sorry for all the trouble I've caused you. I never meant for you to get involved in this. I'm in danger, Maggie, and I can't explain everything now. But I need your help. I need you to trust me. Meet me at the old church, St. Michael's, near the docks. Tomorrow night at midnight. Don't tell anyone.
Come alone.
I love you, Maggie. Always. Margaret clutched the letter to her chest, tears welling up in her eyes. He was alive. He loved her. And he needed her. St. Michael's, Margaret said, her voice choked with emotion. I know it. It's where we used to meet. Clara nodded. He said you'd know. It's a safe place. Or at least it used to be. Tomorrow night, Margaret repeated, her mind racing. Midnight. We have to be careful, Clara said. They'll be watching the church. They'll be expecting you. Then we'll have to find a way to get there without being seen, Margaret said, her resolve hardening. We'll have to be smarter than them. Clara smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. That's the spirit. We'll figure something out. They spent the rest of the day and night planning, devising a strategy to reach St. Michael's undetected. Clara, with her knowledge of the city's underbelly and her experience as a war nurse, proved to be a resourceful and invaluable ally. She knew the back alleys, the hidden passages, the secret routes that would allow them to move through the city unseen. She knew people, too. Other nurses, sympathetic to the cause. A network. They gathered supplies, a change of clothes for Margaret, a map of the city, a small first aid kit. Clara even managed to procure a forged identification paper in case they were stopped. As they worked, Margaret learned more about Clara, about her connection to Henry. She'd served as a nurse in France, in the same field hospital where Henry had been treated for his injuries. She'd seen firsthand the horrors of war, the suffering, the loss. She'd also seen the courage, the resilience, the unwavering spirit of the soldiers she'd cared for. Henry saved my life, Clara said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. He pulled me from a burning building after a bombing raid. He risked his own life to save mine. I owe him everything. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude towards this woman, this stranger who was risking her own safety to help her. She realized that she was not alone in this fight. She had an ally, a friend in Clara. As midnight approached, they prepared to leave. Clara darkened Margaret's hair with soot and dressed her in a plain, dark dress, making her look as inconspicuous as possible. Ready? Clara asked, her eyes searching Margaret's. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She was afraid, terrified even, but she was also determined. She would see Henry again. She would face whatever dangers lay ahead. She would fight for their love, for their future. They slipped out of the building and into the darkness, two women on a dangerous mission, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and hope. The old church, St. Michael's, awaited them, a beacon in the night, a place where secrets would be revealed, and where their love would be tested once again. A wounded soldier's plea had set them on this course, and they would see it through, together. Chapter 7. Letters from a Stranger. The journey to St. Michael's was a tense, nerve-wracking affair. Clara led the way, navigating the dark, deserted streets with a practiced ease. They moved like shadows, sticking to the alleyways, avoiding the main thoroughfares, their senses on high alert for any sign of danger. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest with every creak of a floorboard, every distant shout, every flicker of movement in the shadows. She felt like a hunted animal, constantly looking over her shoulder, expecting to be caught at any moment. Clara, however, remained calm and focused, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, her hand never far from the small knife she carried concealed beneath her cloak. She was a warrior, Margaret realized, hardened by her experiences in the war, her spirit unbroken by the horrors she had witnessed. As they neared the church, the tension increased. The streets were eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of a passing trolley and the mournful hoot of an owl. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the city in a deep, impenetrable darkness. "We're almost there," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible.
"Stay close to me."
They crept along the edge of a crumbling brick wall, their bodies pressed against the cold, rough surface. The church loomed ahead, a dark, imposing silhouette against the night sky. Its stained glass windows, once vibrant and colorful, were now dark and lifeless, reflecting the somber mood of the city. Clara stopped at a small, overgrown gate that led to the churchyard. She peered through the wrought iron bars, her eyes scanning the grounds. "I don't see anyone," she whispered. "But that doesn't mean they're not there. They could be hiding." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was the most dangerous part of their journey. They were exposed, vulnerable, an easy target for anyone who might be watching. Clara carefully unlatched the gate, and they slipped into the churchyard. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The tombstones, their inscriptions worn away by time and weather, stood like silent sentinels, guarding the secrets of the dead. They moved quickly and quietly across the overgrown grass, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. They reached the side door of the church, a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. Clara produced a small, slender tool from her pocket and began to work on the lock. Margaret held her breath, listening intently for any sound that might indicate they had been discovered. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint clicking of the lock as Clara manipulated the tumblers. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. Clara slowly pushed the door inward, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. The air was cold and damp, and the scent of incense and old wood hung heavy in the air. They slipped inside, closing the door softly behind them. They found themselves in a small, narrow passageway that led to the main sanctuary. The only light came from a single flickering candle on a nearby altar, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Henry?" Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. There was no reply. The silence was absolute, unnerving. "He should be here," Clara whispered, her brow furrowed in concern. "He said midnight." They moved cautiously down the passageway, their eyes straining to penetrate the darkness. They reached the entrance to the sanctuary, a vast, echoing space filled with rows of empty pews. The altar, at the far end of the room, was bathed in a faint, ethereal glow from the stained glass windows above. Still no sign of Henry. Margaret felt a wave of disappointment, of despair. Had something happened to him? Had he been captured? Had she come all this way for nothing? "Maybe he's waiting somewhere else," Clara suggested, her voice hopeful. "Let's check the vestry." They made their way to the vestry, a small room behind the altar where the priests prepared for services. The door was ajar, and a faint light spilled out into the hallway. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, filled with religious vestments, books, and candles. And there, sitting on a wooden chair, his head in his hands, was Henry. Margaret gasped, her heart leaping with joy and relief.
Henry.
He looked up, startled, his eyes widening in disbelief. He looked thinner, paler. Then she remembered, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. But it was him. He was alive. He rose from the chair and rushed towards her, his arms outstretched. They embraced, holding each other tightly, as if they would never let go. Margaret buried her face in his shoulder, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maggie," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You came. You actually came." "I told you I would," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. "I'd never leave you." They held each other for a long moment, savoring the warmth and comfort of their embrace. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a moment that transcended the fear and uncertainty that surrounded them. Clara cleared her throat, reminding them of her presence. "We should go," she said softly. "It's not safe to stay here." Henry and Margaret reluctantly broke apart, their eyes locking in a gaze of love and longing. "I have so much to tell you," Henry said, his voice filled with urgency. "But there's no time now." He turned to Clara. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." Clara nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Just be careful, both of you." As they were about to leave, Margaret noticed a small, wooden box on a nearby table. It was old and worn, its surface covered in intricate carvings. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the box. Henry hesitated, his expression turning somber. It's something I need to show you," he said. "Something that will explain everything." He opened the box, revealing a collection of letters, their edges yellowed and brittle with age. They were addressed to Henry, but not from Margaret. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, unfamiliar. "Who are these from?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with a growing sense of unease. Henry took a deep breath. "They're for my mother," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My real mother." Margaret stared at him, confused. "Your real mother? But you said I lied," Henry said, his voice filled with regret. "I lied about a lot of things. I had to protect you, to protect myself." He handed her the letters. "Read them," he said. "They'll explain everything." The return address. England. And a state Margaret didn't recognize. And a name. Not Whitaker. Something else entirely. Something aristocratic. A cold dread began to creep into Margaret's heart, a premonition of a truth that would shatter everything she thought she knew about the man she loved. The letters, she knew, held the key to his past, to his secrets, to the danger that now surrounded them both. Chapter 8. The Bombed-Out Chapel. Margaret took the letters, her hands trembling. The paper felt brittle, fragile, like ancient relics from a forgotten time. She looked at Henry, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What aren't you telling me?" Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted, defeated. "It's a long story, Maggie," he said. "A complicated story. And I don't know where to begin." "Start with the truth," Margaret said, her voice firm. "Start with who you really are." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "My name isn't Henry Whitaker," he said. That's an alias. A name I adopted when I came to America." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She'd known, deep down, that there was something he wasn't telling her. But to hear it confirmed, to hear him admit that he'd been living a lie, was a blow to her heart. "Then who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My real name is Alastair Humphrey, Lord Ashworth," he said, his voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Lord Ashworth. A title, a name that belonged to a world of privilege and power, a world that was completely foreign to Margaret. She stared at him, speechless, her mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of his revelation. He was a lord, an English nobleman. He wasn't the simple carpenter she'd fallen in love with. He was someone else entirely. "I don't understand," she stammered. Why would you lie about something like that?" Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. I had to, he said. I was running away. From my family, from my responsibilities, from a life I didn't want. Running away? Margaret repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. From what? From an arranged marriage, Henry said. From a title I didn't deserve. From a war I didn't believe in. He explained that he was the second son of a powerful and influential English family. His older brother, the heir to the title, had died in a riding accident a few years earlier, leaving Alistair as the reluctant heir. His family had arranged a marriage for him to a woman he didn't love, a woman he barely knew. It was a union designed to consolidate their wealth and power, to secure their place in society. I couldn't do it, Henry said, his voice filled with anguish. I couldn't marry someone I didn't love. I couldn't live a life that wasn't my own. So I ran away. I came to America, hoping to start a new life, to be free. He'd adopted the name Henry Whitaker, taken a job as a carpenter, and tried to blend in, to disappear. He'd never intended to fall in love, to get involved with anyone. But then he'd met Margaret. You changed everything, Maggie, he said, his voice softening. You showed me that it was possible to be happy, to be loved, to be myself. But I knew I couldn't tell you the truth. I was afraid you'd reject me. Afraid you'd think I was a fraud. Margaret felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger, betrayal, confusion, but also understanding. She could see the pain in his eyes, the desperation in his voice. She could understand his desire to escape, to be free. But it didn't change the fact that he'd lied to her. That he'd built their relationship on a foundation of deceit. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked, her voice choked with emotion. Why wait until now? Because I was afraid, he said. And because things have changed. My family, they've found me. Margaret's heart sank. Found you?
How?
Through Eleanor, Henry said. She's my aunt, my mother's sister. She's been helping me, protecting me. But she's also been in contact with my family. She told them I was alive. And they sent that man, Margaret said, remembering the encounter at Ellis Island. The one who wanted me to stop looking for you. Henry nodded. He's a family retainer. Someone who's been with us for years. He's loyal to my father. He's here to bring me back. Back to England? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Back to that life you ran away from? Yes, Henry said. They want me to fulfill my duty. To marry the woman they've chosen for me. To take my place in society. Margaret felt a sharp pain in her chest, as if her heart were breaking. She'd known that their love was fragile, that it was threatened by the war, by the secrets he'd kept hidden. But this was different. This was a threat that came from his past, from his family, from a world she couldn't even comprehend. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and despair.
I don't know, he said.
I don't want to go back. I don't want to lose you. But I don't know how to fight them. They're too powerful. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the church, followed by the sound of shouting. The door to the vestry burst open, and several men stormed into the room. They were rough-looking, dressed in dark clothes, their faces grim and determined. There he is. One of the men shouted. Get him. Henry pushed Margaret behind him, shielding her with his body. Run, Maggie. He yelled. Get out of here. The men lunged at Henry, and a fierce struggle ensued. Margaret watched in horror as Henry fought them off, his fists flying, his body moving with a surprising strength and agility. Clara, who had been standing guard outside the vestry, rushed into the room, brandishing her knife. She joined the fight, slashing at the men, trying to create an opening for Henry and Margaret to escape. But there was too many.
A bomb.
A distant explosion, but close enough to shake the foundations of the old church. The stained glass shattered, raining down on them like deadly jewels. The walls trembled. Dust and debris filled the air. The men, startled by the explosion, momentarily lost their focus. Henry seized the opportunity. He grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her towards a small, hidden door behind the altar. This way, he yelled, his voice hoarse. It leads to the catacombs. They stumbled through the door and into a dark, narrow passageway. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of earth and decay filled their nostrils. They were in the catacombs, the ancient burial chambers beneath the church. The sound of the men's shouts echoed behind them, growing closer. They were being pursued. They ran through the labyrinthine tunnels, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. They had to escape. They had to find a way out. Their love, their future, depended on it. The bombed-out chapel had become their battleground, their escape route, and the place where their love would be tested like never before. Chapter 9. Under a sky of fire. The catacombs were a maze of narrow, winding passages, their walls lined with ancient tombs and crumbling skeletons. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, and the darkness was almost complete, broken only by the faint glow of Henry's pocket torch. Margaret stumbled blindly, her hand clasped tightly in Henry's. She could hear the shouts of their pursuers echoing behind them, growing closer with every step. Fear gnawed at her, a cold, creeping dread that threatened to overwhelm her. "Where are we going?" she gasped, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "There's an exit near the river," Henry replied, his voice strained. "It's our only chance." They ran on, their lungs burning, their legs aching. The tunnels twisted and turned, branching off in different directions, making it impossible to tell where they were going. Margaret felt lost, disoriented, trapped in a subterranean nightmare. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook violently. Another explosion, closer this time, rocked the catacombs. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and a section of the tunnel ahead collapsed, blocking their path. "We're trapped," Margaret cried, her voice filled with despair. Henry shone his torch on the rubble, his face grim. "There has to be another way," he said. "There has to be." They searched frantically for an alternate route, their hands scraping against the cold, damp stone. The shouts of their pursuers were growing louder, closer. They were running out of time. Clara, who had fallen behind during the chase, caught up with them, her face covered in dust, her uniform torn. "What happened?" she asked, her voice breathless. "The tunnel collapsed," Henry said. "We're trapped." Clara quickly assessed the situation, her eyes darting around the narrow passage. "There might be another way," she said. "There's an old map in the vestry. It shows all the tunnels, all the exits. But we can't go back there," Margaret said. "They'll be waiting for us." "I'll go," Clara said. "You two stay here. Hide. I'll be back as soon as I can." Before Henry or Margaret could protest, Clara had disappeared back into the darkness, her footsteps fading away. Henry and Margaret huddled together in a small alcove, their bodies trembling. They could hear the men's voices now, just around the corner. They were trapped, with nowhere to go. "I'm sorry, Maggie," Henry whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I never wanted to put you in danger." Margaret leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "It's not your fault," she said. "You were trying to protect me." "But I failed," he said. "I failed you. I failed everyone." "Don't say that," Margaret said fiercely. "You haven't failed. We're still here. We're still together. And we'll find a way out of this. We have to." They fell silent, listening to the approaching footsteps of their pursuers. They knew that it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance, flickering like a candle in the wind. It was Clara, returning with the map. "I found it," she whispered, her voice triumphant. "There's another exit. It's not far from here." She spread the map on the ground, and Henry shone his torch on it. The map was old and fragile, its lines faded and blurred, but they could make out the intricate network of tunnels and passages. "There," Clara said, pointing to a small, unmarked passage near their current location. "That should lead to the riverbank. It's a long shot, but it's our only chance." They set off again, following Clara's lead. The passage was narrow and low, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the passage. They found themselves in a small, circular chamber, its walls covered in moss and lichen. In the center of the chamber was a large, iron grate, set into the floor. "This is it," Clara said. "This is the exit." Henry tried to lift the grate, but it was rusted shut, immovable. "It's stuck," he said, his voice strained. "I can't open it." They pushed and pulled, their combined strength unable to budge the heavy grate. They were trapped again. Suddenly, they heard a loud crash behind them. The men had found them. "There they are," one of the men shouted.
"Get them."
Henry and Margaret turned to face their pursuers, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were cornered, with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But then something unexpected happened. The sky above them, visible through the gaps in the crumbling ceiling of the chamber, lit up with a blinding flash of light. Another explosion, even closer than before, shook the ground beneath them. The grate, weakened by the blast, suddenly gave way, collapsing into the darkness below. A gaping hole opened up in the floor, revealing a narrow, rushing stream of water. "The river," Clara exclaimed. "We can escape through here." Without hesitation, they jumped into the hole, plunging into the cold, dark water. The current was strong, pulling them swiftly through a narrow, underground tunnel. They surfaced, gasping for air, in the middle of the river. The city was ablaze, the sky above them a fiery inferno of explosions and smoke. The war had come to New York. They swam to the shore, their bodies numb with cold, their clothes soaked and heavy. They had escaped the catacombs, but they were far from safe. They were stranded in a city under attack, with enemies on all sides. But they were alive, and they were together. And as long as they had each other, they had a chance to survive, a chance to find a way out of this nightmare, a chance to build a future together. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They had survived the bombed-out chapel, the catacombs, the pursuers. But their journey was far from over. The burning city was reflected in their eyes, a testament to the chaos they had escaped and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Chapter 10. The Spy's Confession. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning buildings as Henry, Margaret, and Clara huddled together on the riverbank, shivering in their wet clothes. The city skyline was a jagged silhouette against the fiery sky, the constant explosions illuminating the scene with an eerie, flickering light. "We need to get out of here," Clara said, her voice urgent. "This place isn't safe." "But where can we go?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "They'll be looking for us everywhere." Henry, his face grim, scanned their surroundings. "There's a safe house," he said. "Not far from here. It's used by people like me." "People like you?" Margaret asked, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Spies, you mean?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "I told you I was working for Eleanor. Doing dangerous work. I was a courier, carrying messages, delivering information. I was part of a network of spies, working against the enemy." Margaret stared at him, aghast. She'd known he was hiding something, that he was involved in something dangerous. But she'd never imagined the full extent of his deception. He was a spy. A traitor, in the eyes of some. "But who is the enemy?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The Germans? The Austrians?" Henry shook his head. "It's not that simple, Maggie," he said. It's more complicated than that. The enemy is within. It's my own family." Margaret's heart sank. She remembered the letters, the aristocratic name, the arranged marriage. His family. They were the ones who were after him. They were the ones who wanted him silenced. "Your family is working with the enemy?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Not all of them," Henry said. "Just my father. And some of his associates. They're profiting from the war. Selling secrets, supplying arms to both sides. They're traitors, Maggie. And I found out about it." He discovered evidence of his father's treachery, hidden in the family estate in England. He'd tried to expose him, to bring him to justice. But his father was too powerful, too influential. He'd silenced his son, arranged the marriage to keep him under control, and threatened to kill him if he ever revealed the truth. That's why Henry had run away. That's why he'd come to America, adopted a new identity, and tried to disappear. But his father had found him, through Eleanor, and now they were hunting him down, determined to silence him forever. I never wanted to involve you in this, Maggie, Henry said, his voice filled with regret. I never wanted to put you in danger. But I had no choice. I needed your help. Margaret looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and understanding. She was furious that he'd lied to her, that he'd dragged her into this dangerous world. But she also understood his desperation, his fear. She knew that he'd done it to protect her, to protect himself. What do we do now? She asked, her voice steadier now. We get to the safe house, Henry said. We contact my allies. They can help us. They can protect us. And then what? Margaret asked. What about your family? What about your father? Henry's face hardened. They have to be stopped, he said. Their treachery has to be exposed. I have to tell the world the truth.
But how?
Margaret asked. They're too powerful. They'll silence you before you can even speak. I have proof, Henry said. The letter's the evidence I found in England. It's all hidden, in a safe place. If I can get to it, if I can get it to the right people, I can bring them down. And what about us? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. What about our future? Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with love and longing. I don't know, Maggie, he said. I don't know what the future holds. But I know this. I love you, and I'll do whatever it takes to be with you. To build a life with you. A life free from fear, free from lies. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Will you help me, Maggie? He asked. Will you stand by me, even now? Margaret looked into his eyes, and she saw the truth there, the love, the desperation. She knew that he was a flawed man, a man who had made mistakes, a man who had lived a lie. But he was also the man she loved, the man she had promised to marry. She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a fierce determination. I will, she said. I'll help you. I'll stand by you. Always. Clara, who had been listening silently, stepped forward. I'm with you too, Henry, she said. I owe you my life. And I believe in what you're doing. They set off again, moving quickly and quietly through the burning city. The streets were chaotic, filled with panicked civilians, fleeing the bombs, the fires, the chaos. The air was thick with smoke, and the sounds of explosions and gunfire echoed all around them. They reached the safe house, a small, unassuming building in a quiet residential neighborhood. Henry knocked on the door in a specific pattern, and a moment later, it was opened by a young man with a wary expression. Alistair? The man said, his eyes widening in surprise. What are you doing here? And who are these women? They're with me, Henry said. We're in trouble. We need help. The man ushered them inside, closing and bolting the door behind them. The safe house was small but comfortable, furnished with a few simple pieces of furniture, a radio, and a map of the city on the wall. What happened? The man asked, his voice concerned. Henry quickly explained the situation, the attack on the church, the pursuit through the catacombs, the bombing of the city. The man listened intently, his face growing grimmer with each detail. Your father is a dangerous man, Alistair, he said. He has eyes and ears everywhere. He won't stop until he's silenced you. I know, Henry said. That's why we need your help. We need to get to my evidence. We need to expose him. It won't be easy, the man said. But we'll do what we can. We have contacts, allies in high places. We can get your story out. We can protect you. He turned to Margaret and Clara. You're safe here, he said. For now. But you need to be careful. You need to stay hidden. He hesitated and turned to Henry. The confession, Alistair. It's time. Henry nodded, understanding. He pulled out a small, leather-bound journal from his pocket. He started writing. Every detail, every name, every transaction. His father's betrayal. Margaret watched him, that his confession will change everything. For better or for worse. He had to do it. For his country and for their future. The spy's confession was his weapon, his only hope of defeating his powerful enemies. And Margaret and Clara were his shield, his reason to keep fighting. Chapter 11. Betrayal in the Trenches. Hours turned into days, and the safe house became a temporary sanctuary, a bubble of relative calm amidst the raging storm of war and betrayal. Henry spent most of his time working with the other spies, planning their next move, trying to find a way to get his evidence to the authorities, to expose his father's treachery. Margaret and Clara, meanwhile, did what they could to help, providing support, keeping watch, and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in their increasingly abnormal world. They shared stories, fears, and hopes, forging a bond of friendship that transcended their different backgrounds and experiences. Margaret learned more about Henry's life as a spy, about the dangerous missions he'd undertaken, the risks he'd taken, the secrets he'd kept. She began to understand the weight of the burden he'd carried, the constant fear of exposure, the loneliness of living a double life. She also learned more about his family, about the power and influence they wielded, the ruthless methods they employed to protect their interests. She realized that Henry was not just fighting his father, he was fighting an entire system, a corrupt and entrenched network of power that spanned continents and reached into the highest echelons of society. One evening, as they sat around a small table, sharing a meager meal of bread and cheese, Henry told them a story about his time in the trenches, a story that revealed a deeper layer of his past, a darker secret that he'd kept hidden even from himself. It was during the Battle of the Somme, he began, his voice low and strained. We were pinned down in a muddy trench, under constant bombardment. The Germans were just across the field, no more than 100 yards away. We were losing men every day, every hour. It was hell on earth. He paused, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his eyes filled with a haunting memory. There was a young soldier in my unit, he continued. A boy, really. Barely 18. He was from a small village in Yorkshire. He joined up with his friends, full of patriotic fervor, eager to fight for king and country. He was a good lad, innocent and full of life, and always had this naive enthusiasm for the war. He wrote letters home every day, to his mother, to his sweetheart. He talked about going home, about getting married, about starting a family. One day, we were ordered to make an attack across no man's land. It was a suicide mission, everyone knew it. But we had our orders. We had to go. We climbed out of the trench and started running, towards the German lines. The machine guns opened up, mowing us down like wheat. Men were falling all around me, screaming, dying. It was a massacre. I saw the young soldier, the boy from Yorkshire, running beside me. He was smiling, his eyes shining with excitement. He thought he was invincible. He thought he was going to be a hero. Then a shell exploded right in front of us. I was thrown to the ground, knocked unconscious. When I came to, I was lying in a crater, surrounded by dead bodies. The boy, he was gone, blown to pieces. There was nothing left of him. Henry fell silent, his body trembling. Margaret reached out and took his hand, her heart aching for him. I could have saved him, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I could have pulled him back. I could have told him to stay down. But I didn't. I just ran. I left him to die. Margaret squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with tears. It wasn't your fault, Henry, she said. You couldn't have known. You couldn't have saved him. But I should have, he insisted. I was his officer. It was my responsibility to protect him. And I failed. I failed him. I failed them all. He'd carried that guilt with him ever since, the weight of that young soldier's death, the memory of that horrific battle. It had haunted his dreams, fueled his nightmares, driven him to run away from the war, from his responsibilities, from himself. That's why I left the army, he said. That's why I came to America. I couldn't face it anymore. The killing, the dying, the senseless waste of human life. I had to get away. But he hadn't been able to escape the war, not really. It had followed him, across the ocean, into his new life. And now, it was threatening to consume him, to destroy everything he held dear. The guilt and the memories were pulling him under. There was something else too, Maggie, he said, his eyes averted. Something I saw that day. Something that changed everything. What was it? Margaret asked, her voice soft. Before the attack, and just before the shell exploded, I saw a figure emerge from the German line, Henry said, his voice hesitant. It was an officer, I knew it. His uniform, distinct. But what I saw next at IT makes no sense. What? What did you see? He was talking to someone, on our side. They were exchanging something, papers, I believe. One of our officers. Then I saw his face. Our officer. The man ISAW-IT was my father. He saw his own father talking to the enemy. Margaret stared at him, stunned. This was the root of it all. The betrayal he discovered. It wasn't just business arms dealing. It was personal. It was in the trenches. It all makes sense now, Henry continued, his voice filled with a bitter realization. My father, at the front, colluding with the enemy. It must have been him all along, sabotaging the war effort from within. It wasn't just about profit, it was about power, a twisted loyalty, a whole network of betrayals. He stood up, the energy in his body manic, angry. I have to stop him, Maggie. I have to expose them all. Not just for me, but for that boy, for all the soldiers who died because of their greed and their treachery. The burden that fell on Margaret was almost physical in nature. It was more than espionage. It was familial betrayal. He was ready for the final confrontation. The trenches had prepared him, in a way, for this very moment. The personal betrayal had ignited a fire in him, a determination to avenge not only his own past, but the deaths of countless others. And Margaret knew, standing in that small room, that their lives were forever changed, tied to a conflict far greater than their own love story. Chapter 12. A Promise at Dawn. The revelation of Henry's father's presence in the trenches, his direct betrayal, hung heavy in the air, transforming the safe house from a refuge into a crucible of resolve. The stakes were no longer just about exposing a corrupt business deal, they were about confronting a deep-seated, personal treachery that had cost countless lives, including those Henry had fought alongside. We need to move quickly, Henry said, his voice firm, his eyes burning with a newfound intensity. My father won't hesitate to use any means necessary to silence me. And now that he knows I'm aware of his direct involvement, the danger is even greater. The other spies in the safe house, who had initially been cautious and reserved, now rallied around Henry, their respect for him deepening with the understanding of his personal sacrifice and the magnitude of his father's betrayal. They offered their resources, their contacts, their expertise, all committed to helping him bring down a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. Margaret, too, felt a surge of determination. She had come to America seeking a new life, a life free from the constraints and sorrows of her past. She had found love with Henry, a love that had been tested by war, by secrets, by lies. But now, she saw a purpose beyond their personal happiness, a chance to fight for something bigger, something more important. What's the plan? She asked, her voice steady, her eyes meeting Henry's with unwavering support. We need to get my evidence to the British authorities, Henry said. They're the only ones who can truly hold my father accountable. But getting it out of the country, with the city under attack and my father's agents everywhere, won't be easy. One of the spies, a seasoned operative named Thomas, spoke up.
There's a ship, he said.
A British freighter, leaving from the docks tomorrow morning. It's carrying supplies for the war effort. If we can get the evidence on board, it will be safe. But the docks will be heavily guarded, another spy pointed out. Especially with the city under attack. It will be almost impossible to get through. We have to try, Henry said. It's our only chance. They spent the rest of the night planning, devising a strategy to reach the docks, to get past the guards, to get the evidence onto the ship. It was a risky plan, fraught with danger, but it was the only option they had. Clara, with her medical expertise, prepared a small first aid kit, anticipating the possibility of injuries. She also offered her knowledge of the city's backstreets and alleyways, suggesting a route that would minimize their exposure to the main thoroughfares and the military patrols. As dawn approached, They prepared to leave. The city was still smoldering, the sky a hazy gray, the air thick with the smell of smoke and destruction. The sounds of explosions and gunfire continued, a constant reminder of the ongoing conflict. Henry turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and apprehension.
I don't want you to come, he said.
It's too dangerous. I can't risk your life. Margaret shook her head, her resolve unwavering. I'm not staying behind, she said. I'm with you, Henry. Always. We're in this together. But Henry began to protest.
No buts, Margaret interrupted.
I'm not afraid. And I won't let you face this alone. Henry looked at her, his heart filled with a deep, abiding love. He knew that he couldn't dissuade her, that her spirit was as strong and unyielding as his own. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers.
Then let's do this, he said.
Together, they stepped out of the safe house and into the ravaged streets of New York. The city was a scene of devastation, with buildings reduced to rubble, streets littered with debris, and the air filled with the cries of the wounded and the bereaved. They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the main thoroughfares, their senses on high alert for any sign of danger. Clara led the way, using her knowledge of the city to guide them through the maze of backstreets and alleyways. As they neared the docks, the tension increased. The sounds of gunfire and explosions were louder here, closer, and the streets were filled with soldiers, patrolling the area, searching for enemy agents and saboteurs. They reached a small, deserted alleyway that overlooked the docks. The British freighter was there, its massive hull looming large against the gray sky. It was their target, their only hope of getting the evidence out of the country. But between them and the ship lay a gauntlet of guards, checkpoints, and patrols. It seemed an impossible task, a suicide mission. Henry turned to Margaret and Clara, his face grim.
Stay here, he said.
I'll go alone. It's too dangerous for you. No, Margaret and Clara said in unison. We're a team, Clara added. We stick together. Henry hesitated, then nodded. He knew that he couldn't argue with them, that their loyalty and determination were as strong as his own. He looked at Margaret and said with a solemn tone, If anything happens, promise me. Don't speak like that, Alistair, she responded, her voice firm with a tinge of fear. We will get through this. He took a deep breath, then outlined the plan. They would use the chaos of the attack as a distraction, creating a diversion that would draw the guards away from the ship, allowing them to slip aboard unnoticed. It was a desperate plan, a long shot, but it was their only chance. As they prepared to put their plan into action, the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a pale, ethereal light over the devastated city. The sky was a canvas of gray and orange, a reflection of the fire and destruction below. Henry looked at Margaret, his eyes filled with love and a silent promise. He leaned in and kissed her, a long, lingering kiss that spoke of their love, their hopes, their fears. I love you, Maggie, he whispered. Always. I love you too, Alistair, she replied, her voice choked with emotion. They broke apart, their hearts filled with a mixture of dread and determination. They knew that this could be their last moment together, that their future was uncertain, that their lives were hanging in the balance. But they were ready. They were ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. They were ready to fight for their love, for their future, for justice. They stepped out of the alleyway and into the chaos of the docks, their hearts pounding in their chests, their hands clasped tightly together. A promise at dawn, a promise of love, of hope, of a future they were determined to build, together. The freighter loomed, a symbol of escape and a testament to the dangerous journey ahead. They would get that evidence on board, no matter the cost. Chapter 13. The Stolen Kiss. The docks were a scene of controlled chaos. Soldiers shouted orders, trucks rumbled back and forth, and the air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and seawater. The ongoing attack on the city provided a grim backdrop, with distant explosions and plumes of smoke rising in the distance. Henry, Margaret, and Clara moved cautiously along the edge of the docks, sticking to the shadows, using crates and shipping containers for cover. Their plan was simple, yet incredibly dangerous. Create a diversion that would draw the guards away from the gangplank of the British freighter, allowing them to slip aboard unnoticed. Clara, with her nurse's uniform, would be the key to their plan. She would feign an injury, collapsing near the main checkpoint, drawing the attention of the guards. While they were distracted, Henry and Margaret would make a run for the ship. "Are you sure about this, Clara?" Henry asked, his voice filled with concern. "It's incredibly risky. You could get hurt, or worse." Clara smiled, her eyes shining with determination.
"I've faced worse," she said. "Don't worry about me."
"Just get that evidence on board." They reached a point near the main checkpoint, where a group of soldiers were checking identification papers and searching vehicles. The gangplank of the freighter was just a short distance away, tantalizingly close, yet impossibly far. Clara took a deep breath, then steeled herself. She stumbled forward, clutching her arm, and cried out in pain. She collapsed to the ground, moaning and writhing, putting on a convincing performance of someone in severe distress. The guards, startled by the commotion, rushed towards her, their weapons drawn. "What happened?" one of them demanded. "Are you all right?" Clara continued to moan, pointing to her arm, feigning a serious injury. I fell," she gasped. "I think it's broken. Please help me." The guards, momentarily forgetting their duties, gathered around her, trying to assess her condition. This was the moment.
"Now,"
Henry whispered to Margaret.
"Go."
They broke cover and sprinted towards the gangplank, their hearts pounding in their chests. They ran as fast as they could, their eyes fixed on the ship, their bodies tensed for the inevitable shout, the gunshot, the capture. But the guards were too preoccupied with Clara, too distracted by her feigned injury. They didn't notice Henry and Margaret until it was too late. They reached the gangplank and scrambled aboard the ship, disappearing into the maze of decks and passageways. They had made it. They were on board. But their relief was short-lived. As they made their way towards the cargo hold, where they planned to hide the evidence, they heard a shout behind them. "Stop! You there! Stop!" A guard, alerted by the commotion, had spotted them. He was running towards them, his rifle raised. Henry pushed Margaret behind him, shielding her with his body.
"Run!"
he yelled. "Get to the cargo hold. I'll hold him off." Margaret hesitated, her heart torn. She didn't want to leave him, but she knew that she had to get the evidence to safety. "Be careful," she cried, her voice choked with emotion. She turned and ran, disappearing into the depths of the ship. Henry turned to face the guard, his fists clenched, his body ready for a fight. The guard approached cautiously, his rifle aimed at Henry's chest.
"Who are you?"
he demanded. "What are you doing here?" Henry didn't reply. He lunged at the guard, knocking the rifle from his grasp. They grappled, struggling for control, their bodies locked in a desperate embrace. Meanwhile, Margaret reached the cargo hold, a vast, cavernous space filled with crates, barrels, and machinery. The air was thick with the smell of oil and sawdust. She quickly located a large, empty crate, marked for shipment to London. She pried it open, her fingers trembling, and placed the leather-bound journal containing Henry's evidence inside. She closed the crate, sealing it shut, hiding the evidence from prying eyes. She then found a dark corner, behind a stack of crates, and waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her ears straining for any sound of Henry. The minutes ticked by, stretching into an eternity. She heard the sounds of shouting, of struggling, of gunfire, echoing through the ship. She didn't know what was happening, if Henry was alive or dead, if they had been discovered. Suddenly, the door to the cargo hold burst open, and a figure stumbled inside. It was Henry, his clothes torn, his face bruised and bloody. Margaret rushed towards him, her heart filled with relief and fear. "Henry, are you all right?" He nodded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I lost him," he said. "In the engine room. I think we're safe. For now." They embraced, holding each other tightly, their bodies trembling. They had made it. They had gotten the evidence on board. They had survived. But their journey was far from over. The ship was still in the docks, surrounded by danger. They had to stay hidden until it set sail, until they were safely out of reach of Henry's father and his agents. As they huddled together in the darkness of the cargo hold, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was coming. They held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. Were they discovered? Was this the end? The footsteps stopped just outside the cargo hold. A voice called out, a familiar voice. Alistair? Margaret? Are you in there? It was Clara. Relief washed over them, so intense it almost brought them to their knees. They had all made it. They were together. Henry opened the door, and Clara stepped inside, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes shining with relief. I got away, she said, her voice trembling. The guards they were distracted by the explosions. I managed to slip away. They embraced her, welcoming her into their small circle of survivors. They were three, united by a common purpose, bound by a shared danger. As they huddled together in the darkness, waiting for the ship to set sail, they heard a commotion on the deck above. Shouting, running footsteps, the sound of a struggle. Then silence. A few moments later, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs leading down into the cargo hold. It was one of the spies from the safe house, Thomas, the one who had told them about the ship. Alistair, he called out. We have a problem. Your father's men, they're on board. They're searching the ship. Henry's face hardened. How many? He asked. At least a dozen, Thomas replied. Heavily armed. They know you're here. Henry looked at Margaret and Clara, his eyes filled with a grim determination. We have to fight, he said. We have to protect the evidence. We can't let them get it. He reached out, and in the dim light found Margaret's face, her lips.
Akish.
Desperate, passionate, but also tinged with the possibility that this could very well be their last. A stolen kiss, in the midst of chaos. A brief respite from the danger, a confirmation of their love before the fight. Then, he turned to face the stairs, his body tensed, his fists clenched. He was ready to fight, ready to die, if necessary, to protect the woman he loved, to expose his father's treachery, to bring justice to the countless victims of his greed and ambition. The stolen kiss was a reminder of what they were fighting for, a symbol of their love amidst the storm. It was a moment of intimacy, a spark of hope, in the face of overwhelming odds. But now, the fight was on. Chapter 14. The Escape from Paris. Note: the previous chapter ended with the characters on the ship in New York. This chapter will shift the scene to follow the intended trajectory, focusing on the challenges faced after the evidence is secured and the pursuit continues, transitioning to a new location relevant to the overall narrative: Paris, a hub of wartime activity and espionage. The ship, a temporary haven, had become a floating battleground. Henry, Margaret, Clara, and Thomas knew that they couldn't stay hidden in the cargo hold forever. Their pursuers, Henry's father's men, were systematically searching the ship, deck by deck, hold by hold. It was only a matter of time before they were discovered. We need to get off the ship, Henry said, his voice low and urgent. Before it sets sail. If we're caught at sea, we'll be trapped.
But how?
Margaret asked. The docks are crawling with his men. We'll never make it past them. Thomas, the resourceful spy, had an idea. There's a lifeboat, he said, on the starboard side. It's small, barely noticeable. If we can get to it, we can lower it into the water and escape unnoticed. It was a risky plan, but it was their only option. They couldn't stay on the ship, and they couldn't risk being captured. They crept out of the cargo hold and made their way cautiously along the deck, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the searchlights that swept across the water. The sounds of the ongoing search echoed through the ship, the heavy footsteps of their pursuers growing closer with every passing moment. They reached the starboard side of the ship and located the lifeboat, a small, wooden vessel hidden beneath a tarpaulin. It was their escape, their only hope of getting off the ship alive. But as they were preparing to lower the lifeboat, they heard a shout behind them. There they are. Stop them. Their pursuers had found them. A group of heavily armed men rushed towards them, their weapons drawn. Henry pushed Margaret and Clara behind him, shielding them with his body. Thomas, drawing a small pistol from his pocket, opened fire, providing a momentary distraction. "Get to the lifeboat," Henry yelled. "I'll hold them off." Margaret and Clara scrambled to untie the ropes that secured the lifeboat, their fingers trembling with fear and urgency. Henry and Thomas engaged in a fierce gun battle with their pursuers, the sounds of gunfire echoing across the deck. The lifeboat was finally free. Margaret and Clara jumped inside, and with a desperate push, they launched it over the side of the ship. The small boat plunged into the dark water below, narrowly missing a passing patrol boat. Henry and Thomas, seeing that Margaret and Clara were safe, made a daring leap from the deck, plunging into the icy water beside the lifeboat. They swam towards it, dodging bullets, and scrambled aboard, soaked and shivering. They rowed furiously, pulling away from the ship, disappearing into the darkness of the harbor. They had escaped, but they were far from safe. They were adrift in a small boat, in the middle of a war zone, with enemies on all sides. Their immediate destination was unknown, their future uncertain. But they had survived the immediate danger, and they had the evidence, safely hidden in Margaret's possession. Days later, after a harrowing journey across the Atlantic, hidden in various ships and enduring multiple close calls, they finally arrived in Paris. The city, a hub of wartime activity and espionage, was a dangerous place, but it also offered opportunities, contacts, and a chance to get Henry's evidence to the right people. Paris was a city of shadows, of secrets, of hidden alliances and deadly betrayals. The streets were filled with spies, soldiers, refugees, and opportunists, all vying for power, for survival, for a chance at a better future. They found refuge in a small, unassuming apartment in a quiet neighborhood, far from the bustling boulevards and the grand hotels where the spies and the diplomats gathered. It was a temporary sanctuary, a place to rest, to regroup, to plan their next move. Their contact in Paris, a mysterious woman known only as Madame Dubois, was a key figure in the French resistance, a network of spies and saboteurs working to undermine the German occupation. She was a formidable woman, with a sharp mind, a vast network of informants, and a ruthless determination to fight for her country. Madame Dubois listened intently to Henry's story, examining the evidence he had brought with him, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "This is extraordinary," she said, her voice low and intense. "Your father, he is a monster. He must be stopped." She agreed to help them, to get the evidence to the British authorities, to expose Henry's father and his network of collaborators. But she warned them that it would be a dangerous undertaking, that their enemies were powerful and ruthless, and that they would stop at nothing to silence them. "You must be careful," she said. "Paris is a dangerous place. Trust no one. Watch your backs.
And be prepared to fight."
They knew that their journey was far from over. They had escaped from New York, survived the perilous journey across the Atlantic, but they were now in a new battleground, a city filled with spies and secrets, where danger lurked around every corner. The escape from the ship in New York was just the beginning of a new, even more perilous chapter, one that would test their courage, their resilience, and their love for each other in ways they could never have imagined. They had traded one war zone for another, and the stakes were higher than ever. Chapter 15. The reunion that wasn't. In Paris, the weight of their mission pressed down on them. Madame Dubois, their enigmatic contact, had arranged a clandestine meeting with a British intelligence officer, a Major Thompson, who was stationed in the city. The meeting was set for a secluded café in a quiet part of Montmartre, a place where artists and poets once gathered, now a haven for whispered conversations and secret rendezvous. Henry, Margaret, and Clara prepared meticulously. They knew that this meeting was their best chance to get the evidence into the right hands, to expose Henry's father and his network of collaborators. But they also knew that it was a dangerous gamble, that their enemies were likely watching their every move. As they made their way to the café, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled in her stomach. The streets of Paris, once vibrant and romantic, now felt menacing, filled with hidden eyes and unseen threats. The city was a beautiful mask, concealing a dark and dangerous underbelly. They arrived at the cafe, a small, unassuming establishment with a few tables scattered on the sidewalk. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of coffee and Gaulois cigarettes. They spotted Major Thompson sitting at a table in the back, a solitary figure with a stern expression and watchful eyes. Henry approached the Major, introducing himself and his companions. Thompson greeted them curtly, his gaze assessing them with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. They sat down, and Henry began to explain the situation, the evidence he had gathered, the treachery of his father. Thompson listened intently, his expression unchanging. He asked pointed questions, probing for details, testing the veracity of Henry's claims. Margaret watched him carefully, trying to gauge his reaction, trying to determine if he was friend or foe. As Henry was presenting the evidence, a leather-bound journal detailing his father's transactions and communications with the enemy, a sudden commotion erupted outside the cafe. Shouts, screams, the screech of tires. The door to the cafe burst open, and several men in dark suits stormed inside, their weapons drawn. They were Henry's father's men. Margaret knew it instantly. They had been followed. "There he is," one of the men shouted, pointing at Henry. "Get him." Chaos erupted. Tables were overturned, glasses shattered, and patrons screamed and scattered. Henry, reacting instantly, grabbed Margaret's hand and pulled her towards the back of the cafe, towards a small, unmarked door. "This way," he yelled. "It's an escape route." Clara and Major Thompson followed close behind, providing cover fire, trying to hold off their attackers. The cafe became a battleground, a scene of gunfire and violence. They burst through the back door and found themselves in a narrow alleyway, their escape route leading into the labyrinthine streets of Montmartre. They ran, their lungs burning, their hearts pounding, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. But as they rounded a corner, they ran straight into another group of armed men, blocking their path. They were surrounded, trapped. Henry pushed Margaret behind him, shielding her with his body. He knew that this could be the end, that they had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "It's over, Alistair," a voice called out. A familiar voice, cold and cruel. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and piercing eyes. It was Henry's father, Lord Ashworth. "Father," Henry said, his voice filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. "You should have stayed in America, Alistair," Lord Ashworth said. "You should have obeyed me. Now it's too late." "I will never obey you," Henry said. "I will never let you get away with your treachery." Lord Ashworth smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "You have no choice, my son," he said. "You are powerless against me." He gestured to his men. "Take them," he ordered, "and kill the women." The men lunged forward, their weapons raised. Henry prepared to fight, to defend himself and Margaret, even though he knew it was hopeless. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with a fierce expression and a pistol in her hand. It was Madame Dubois. "Not so fast, Lord Ashworth," she said, her voice cold and steady. She fired her pistol, hitting one of the men, sending him sprawling to the ground. A fierce gun battle erupted in the narrow alleyway, the sounds of gunfire echoing off the walls. Madame Dubois, a skilled fighter, moved with a deadly grace, taking down several of Lord Ashworth's men. She created an opening, a chance for Henry and Margaret to escape. "Go," she yelled. "Get out of here. I'll hold them off." Henry hesitated, torn between his desire to stay and fight and his need to protect Margaret. "Go, Alistair," Margaret urged. "We have to get the evidence to safety. We can't let him win." Henry nodded, his heart heavy with guilt and regret. He grabbed Margaret's hand, and they ran, disappearing into the maze of streets, leaving Madame Dubois to face his father and his men. They ran blindly, not knowing where they were going, their only thought to escape, to survive. They could hear the sounds of gunfire fading behind them, a testament to the fierce battle that was raging in the alleyway. They finally reached a small, deserted square, far from the scene of the ambush. They collapsed against a wall, their bodies trembling, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They had escaped, but at a terrible cost. Madame Du Bois had sacrificed herself to save them. And Major Thompson, he was gone. Captured, or worse, dead. The planned reunion, the handover of the evidence, had turned into a bloody ambush. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with despair. "We've lost everything. Our contact, our escape route, our chance to expose your father." Henry looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim determination. "No," he said. "We haven't lost everything. We still have the evidence. And we still have each other. We'll find another way. We have to." They were alone, hunted, with nowhere to turn. But they were not defeated. They would find a way to expose Lord Ashworth, to bring him to justice, to honor the sacrifices of those who had helped them. The reunion that wasn't had become a turning point, a moment of devastating loss, but also a catalyst for a renewed determination to fight, to survive, to win. The City of Lights had become their hunting ground, and they were both predator and prey. Chapter 16. The weight of his past. The failed meeting at the cafe and the subsequent ambush left Henry and Margaret reeling, adrift in a city that felt increasingly hostile. They were fugitives, hunted by Henry's powerful father, with their only ally, Madame Du Bois, presumably captured or dead. The weight of their precarious situation pressed down on them, compounded by the guilt Henry felt for the sacrifices made on their behalf. They found temporary refuge in a small, dingy room above a bakery, the air thick with the sweet smell of bread, a stark contrast to the bitter reality of their circumstances. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single bed, a rickety table, and a cracked wash basin. It was a far cry from the grand estates Henry had known in his former life, but it was safe for now. As they settled into their new hiding place, Margaret noticed a change in Henry. He became withdrawn, his usual warmth and gentle demeanor replaced by a brooding silence. He spent hours staring out the window, his gaze fixed on the rooftops of Paris, his mind seemingly miles away. "Henry," Margaret said softly, approaching him. "What's wrong?"
"Talk to me."
He turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, a pain that she had glimpsed before, but never fully understood. "It's my fault," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "All of this, Madame Du Bois, Major Thompson, it's all because of me. Because of my family. Because of my past." Margaret sat beside him, taking his hand in hers. "It's not your fault, Henry," she said. "You didn't choose this life. You didn't choose to have a father who is a traitor."
"But I should have known," he said.
"I should have seen the signs. I should have done something sooner." He told her about his childhood, about growing up in the shadow of his powerful and domineering father. He spoke of the lavish lifestyle, the grand estates, the endless parties and social gatherings. But he also spoke of the coldness, the distance, the lack of affection. "My father, he was never a warm man," Henry said. "He was always more concerned with his business, with his power, with his reputation. He never had time for me, for my mother. We were accessories, trophies to be displayed, not people to be loved." He had always felt like an outsider in his own family, a misfit in a world of privilege and entitlement. He had rebelled against his father's expectations, refusing to follow in his footsteps, choosing instead to pursue his own interests, his own passions. "I loved to build things," he said, "to create things with my own hands. That's why I became a carpenter. It was an escape, a way to be myself, to be free from my father's control." But he had never been able to fully escape his past, his family, the weight of his inheritance. It had followed him, across the ocean, into his new life. And now, it was threatening to destroy everything he held dear. "I thought I could leave it all behind," he said. "I thought I could start over, be someone else. But I was wrong. You can't escape your past. It always catches up with you." Margaret listened patiently, her heart aching for him. She understood his pain, his guilt, his sense of responsibility. She knew that he was carrying a burden that was almost too heavy to bear. "You can't blame yourself, Henry," she said. "You did what you thought was right. You tried to escape a life you didn't want. You tried to protect those you loved. But I failed, he said. I failed them all. No, Margaret said fiercely. You haven't failed. We're still here. We're still together. And we'll find a way through this. We have to. She reminded him of the evidence, the leather-bound journal that contained the proof of his father's treachery. It was their only weapon, their only hope of bringing him to justice. We can't give up now, Henry, she said. We have to keep fighting. For ourselves, for those who have sacrificed for us, for the future. Her words seemed to reach him, to penetrate the darkness that had enveloped him. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a glimmer of hope, a spark of the man she had fallen in love with. You're right, Maggie, he said. We can't give up. We have to keep fighting. He stood up, his body straightening, his resolve hardening. He was no longer the defeated, guilt-ridden man who had been staring out the window. He was Alistair Humphrey, Lord Ashworth, the man who had defied his father, the man who was determined to expose his treachery.
We need a plan, he said.
We need to find another way to get the evidence to the authorities. We need to find someone we can trust. They spent the rest of the day brainstorming, trying to come up with a new strategy. They knew that they couldn't rely on the established channels, that their enemies were too powerful, too well connected. They needed to find someone outside the system, someone who was willing to take a risk, someone who believed in justice. Someone who understood the devastating power of secrets. As night fell, they lay together on the narrow bed, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. They found solace in each other's arms, a moment of peace in the midst of chaos, a reminder of the love that had brought them together, the love that sustained them through the darkest of times. The weight of his past was still there, but it was shared, lessened by her presence. And together, they would face the future, whatever it may hold. Chapter 17. The Truth in the Ruins. The next few days were a blur of hushed conversations, clandestine meetings, and narrow escapes. Henry and Margaret, guided by fragmented information gleaned from whispers in the Parisian underworld and aided by a few remaining contacts loyal to Madame Du Bois, moved from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of their pursuers. They were living on the edge, their nerves frayed, their trust eroded by betrayal and loss. They learned that Major Thompson had indeed been captured by Lord Ashworth's men. His fate remained unknown, a grim reminder of the stakes they were facing. Madame Du Bois, however, was rumored to be alive, held captive in a secret location somewhere in the city. The hope of rescuing her flickered faintly, a distant possibility that fueled their determination. Henry, driven by a renewed sense of purpose, focused all his energy on finding a way to get the evidence to the British authorities. He knew that time was running out, that his father would be tightening his grip on the city, using his influence and resources to hunt them down. He remembered a name, a contact from his days as a courier, a British journalist named Evelyn Reed, who was known for her investigative work and her unwavering commitment to exposing the truth. She was based in Paris, working for a small, independent newspaper that had a reputation for challenging the powerful and exposing corruption. Evelyn Reed was a long shot, a risky gamble. She was known for her independence, her distrust of authority, her refusal to be intimidated. But she was also known for her integrity, her courage, her dedication to uncovering the truth, no matter the cost. Henry decided to take the risk. He sent a coded message to Evelyn Reed, through a trusted intermediary, requesting a meeting. He knew that he was putting himself and Margaret in danger, but he saw no other option. The meeting was arranged for a secluded location, a bombed-out church on the outskirts of the city, a place where the ravages of war were starkly visible. The church was a ruin, its roof shattered, its walls crumbling, its stained glass windows broken and scattered. It was a symbol of destruction, of loss, but also of resilience, of hope. As they waited in the ruins, the silence was broken only by the distant rumble of artillery fire and the mournful cry of the wind whistling through the shattered windows. The air was cold and damp, and the scent of decay hung heavy in the air. Margaret shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. She looked at Henry, his face etched with worry and determination. She knew that this meeting could be their salvation, or their downfall. Suddenly, A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with a sharp, intelligent face and piercing blue eyes. She was dressed in a practical, no-nonsense manner, her clothes bearing the marks of wear and tear. It was Evelyn Reed. "Mr. Whitaker, I presume?" she said, her voice crisp and direct. "It's Ashworth, actually," Henry replied. "Alastair Humphrey, Lord Ashworth." Evelyn Reed raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "A lord? Involved in espionage? This is unusual." Henry quickly explained the situation, his father's treachery, the evidence he had gathered, the danger they were in. He showed her the leather-bound journal, the proof of his father's collaboration with the enemy. Evelyn Reed listened intently, her eyes scanning the documents, her expression growing increasingly serious. She asked probing questions, challenging his assumptions, testing the validity of his claims. Margaret watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. She knew that this woman held their fate in her hands, that her decision could mean the difference between life and death. After a long silence, Evelyn Reed closed the journal, her expression grave. "This is explosive," she said. "If this is true, it could change the course of the war. It could bring down governments." "It is true," Henry said, his voice firm. "I swear it." Evelyn Reed looked at him, her eyes searching his face, trying to discern the truth. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the conviction in his voice, the weight of the burden he was carrying. "I believe you," she said finally. "But getting this evidence to the right people, it won't be easy. Your father has powerful friends, powerful enemies. He'll stop at nothing to silence you."
"We know," Henry said.
"We're prepared to take the risk." Evelyn Reed nodded, her mind already racing, formulating a plan. "I have contacts," she said. "In London, in the War Office. People I trust. People who can get this evidence to the right people." She outlined her plan. A daring scheme to smuggle the evidence out of Paris, across the Channel, and into the hands of the British authorities. It was a risky undertaking, fraught with danger, but it was their best chance of success. "It won't be easy," she warned them. "You'll have to trust me. You'll have to follow my instructions. And you'll have to be prepared to face the consequences." Henry and Margaret looked at each other, their eyes locking in a silent agreement. They had come this far, they had faced so much, they were not going to back down now. "We're ready," Henry said, his voice firm. "We trust you." Evelyn Reed smiled, a rare and fleeting expression of warmth. "Then let's get to work," she said. "We have a war to win, and a traitor to expose." As they left the ruined church, the setting sun cast long shadows across the devastated landscape. The sky was a canvas of red and orange, a reflection of the fire and destruction that had engulfed the world. The ruins stood as silent witnesses. But amidst the ruins, a new hope had been born. The truth, hidden in the shadows, was about to be revealed. And the consequences for Henry, for Margaret, for his father, for the world, would be profound. The truth in the ruins was their weapon, their shield, their only hope of redemption. Chapter 18. The Long Road Home. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity, a carefully orchestrated dance of deception and daring. Evelyn Reed, with her network of contacts and her unwavering determination, worked tirelessly to arrange the safe passage of the evidence to London. Henry and Margaret, under her guidance, moved from one hiding place to another, always one step ahead of their pursuers, their lives hanging by a thread. They adopted new identities, posing as refugees fleeing the war, their true identities concealed beneath layers of disguise and carefully crafted lies. They traveled by night, avoiding the main roads, sticking to the back alleys and the hidden pathways, their senses on high alert for any sign of danger. Evelyn Reed had arranged for a small fishing boat to smuggle them across the English Channel, a perilous journey across the heavily patrolled waters. The boat was old and creaky, its hull battered by years of storms and neglect, but it was their only hope of reaching England, of getting the evidence to the authorities. The crossing was a nightmare. The sea was rough, the waves crashing against the small boat, threatening to capsize it at any moment. The darkness was complete, broken only by the faint glimmer of the moon and the distant searchlights of enemy patrol boats. Margaret, seasick and terrified, clung to Henry, her body trembling with fear. He held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his voice whispering words of comfort and reassurance.
"We'll make it, Maggie," he said.
"I promise you. We'll make it." They survived the crossing, arriving on the English coast in the dead of night, cold, wet, and exhausted. They were met by Evelyn Reed's contacts, a group of shadowy figures who whisked them away to a safe house, a secluded cottage on the windswept moors of Cornwall. It was a remote and desolate place, far from the prying eyes of Henry's father and his agents. But it was also a place of beauty, of wildness, of freedom. The air was clean and crisp, and the sound of the waves crashing against the cliffs was a constant reminder of the power and the majesty of nature. They spent several days at the cottage, recovering from their ordeal, waiting for Evelyn Reed to make the final arrangements for the handover of the evidence. She had contacted a high-ranking official in the War Office, a man named Sir Charles Hamilton, who was known for his integrity and his unwavering commitment to justice. He was the one person she trusted to handle the evidence, to ensure that it reached the right people, to bring Henry's father to justice. The meeting was set for London, in a discreet location, far from the prying eyes of the press and the public. Henry and Margaret, accompanied by Evelyn Reed, traveled to the city by train, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They arrived in London, a city that was both familiar and foreign to Henry. He had spent his childhood in this city, in the grand houses and the exclusive clubs of his father's world. But he had never felt at home here, never felt like he belonged. Now, he was returning as a fugitive, a traitor in the eyes of some, a hero in the eyes of others. He was returning to confront his past, to expose his father's treachery, to fight for his future. The meeting with Sir Charles Hamilton took place in a small, unassuming office in a quiet street near Whitehall. The room was sparsely furnished, with a single desk, a few chairs, and a large map of Europe on the wall. Sir Charles Hamilton was a tall, imposing man with a stern expression and piercing gray eyes. He greeted them curtly, his gaze assessing them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Henry presented the evidence, the leather-bound journal detailing his father's transactions and communications with the enemy. Sir Charles Hamilton examined the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly grave. "This is damning," he said finally. "This is proof of high treason. Your father, he will be arrested. He will be tried. And he will be punished." Henry felt a wave of relief wash over him, a sense of closure, of justice finally being served. But he also felt a deep sadness, a sense of loss. His father, the man he had once admired, the man he had tried to please, was a traitor, a criminal. "What about us?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What will happen to us?" Sir Charles Hamilton looked at them, his expression softening slightly. "You have done a great service to your country," he said. "You have risked your lives to expose a dangerous traitor. You will be protected. You will be given new identities. You will be able to start a new life, a life free from fear, free from persecution." Henry and Margaret looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. They had come so far, they had faced so much, they had survived. But their journey was not over. They still had to face the consequences of their actions, the fallout from the exposure of Henry's father. They still had to build a new life, a life together, a life free from the shadows of the past. But the long road home was finally visible, the road that led away from espionage and towards a future they would carve together. "Thank you," Henry said, his voice filled with emotion. "Thank you for believing in us. Thank you for giving us a chance." Sir Charles Hamilton nodded, his gaze firm and resolute. "Justice will be served," he said. "That I promise you." As they left the office, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the city. The sky was a canvas of pink and orange, a symbol of hope, of new beginnings. The long road home was still ahead of them, but they were walking it together, hand in hand, their hearts filled with love and a quiet, unwavering determination. Chapter 19. A Love Forged in War. The aftermath of Lord Ashworth's arrest was a media frenzy, a scandal that shook the foundations of British society. The newspapers were filled with headlines screaming of treachery, betrayal, and high treason. The public was outraged, demanding justice, demanding answers. Henry, now known publicly by his true name, Alastair Humphrey, became an instant celebrity, a reluctant hero, hailed for his courage and his patriotism. He was interviewed by journalists, questioned by politicians, and celebrated by the public. But he shunned the spotlight, preferring the quiet solitude of the small cottage in Cornwall where he and Margaret were living under the protection of the British government. He had no desire for fame or recognition. He had only wanted to expose his father's treachery, to bring him to justice, to protect the woman he loved. Margaret, too, was thrust into the public eye, her story captivating the hearts of the nation. She was portrayed as the brave Irish immigrant who had risked everything for love, for justice, for her adopted country. But she, like Henry, preferred the quiet life, the simple pleasures of their new existence. She spent her days exploring the rugged coastline, walking along the windswept beaches, finding solace in the beauty and the tranquility of nature. They were both changed by their experiences, scarred by the war, by the betrayals, by the losses they had endured. But they were also stronger, their love deepened, their bond unbreakable. They spent their evenings together, sitting by the fire, talking, reading, sharing their hopes and dreams for the future. They talked of marriage, of children, of building a life together, a life free from the shadows of the past. One evening, as they sat on the beach, watching the sun set over the ocean, Henry turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with love and tenderness. "Maggie," he said, his voice soft and gentle, "I know we've been through so much, faced so many challenges. But through it all, my love for you has only grown stronger. You are my rock, my anchor, my everything." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring, a diamond sparkling in the fading light. "Will you marry me, Maggie?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Will you be my wife? Will you spend the rest of your life with me?" Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes, tears of joy, of relief, of overwhelming love. She nodded, unable to speak, her heart overflowing with happiness. Henry slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand trembling slightly. It was a perfect fit, a symbol of their love, their commitment, their future together. They embraced, holding each other tightly, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, a breathtaking backdrop to their moment of perfect happiness. They were married a few weeks later, in a small, private ceremony in the village church. Only a few close friends were present, including Evelyn Reed, who had become a trusted confidant and a staunch ally. Clara, sadly, could not be located. Rumors placed her back in France, still working with the resistance. They hoped she was safe. Margaret wore a simple, elegant dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers. Henry wore a dark suit, his face radiant with happiness. As they stood before the altar, exchanging their vows, their eyes locked in a gaze of love and devotion. They had come so far, they had faced so much, but they had finally found their way to each other, to their happily ever after. Their love had been forged in war, tested by fire, strengthened by adversity. It was a love that would endure, a love that would last a lifetime. After the ceremony, they returned to their cottage, their new home, their sanctuary. They spent their wedding night together, their bodies entwined, their hearts filled with a deep and abiding love. They had found peace, finally, after the storm. They had found happiness, after so much sorrow. They had found each other, and that was all that mattered. Their new life was beginning, a life free from fear, free from lies, free from the shadows of the past. They would build a future together, a future filled with love, with laughter, with hope. The war still raged on. The world was still in turmoil, but in their small corner of Cornwall, they had found their own little piece of paradise. A love forged in war, a love that would conquer all. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Hearts. Lord Ashworth's trial was swift and decisive. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the testimony of his own son damning. He was found guilty of high treason and sentenced to life imprisonment. His vast estates were seized by the crown, his title stripped from him, his legacy tarnished forever. The scandal sent shockwaves through British society, exposing a network of corruption and collaboration that reached the highest levels of power. Several prominent figures were implicated, their careers ruined, their reputations destroyed. For Henry, now Alastair Humphrey, the outcome of the trial brought a sense of closure, of justice finally being served. But it also brought a deep sadness, a sense of loss. He had exposed his father's treachery, but he had also lost his family, his inheritance, his place in the world. He and Margaret, however, were determined to build a new life, a life free from the burdens of his past. They decided to stay in Cornwall, in the small cottage that had become their sanctuary. They loved the rugged beauty of the coastline, the wildness of the moors, the peace and quiet of the countryside. They purchased a small farm, a few acres of land where they could raise animals, grow crops, and live a simple, self-sufficient life. Henry, with his carpentry skills, built a new home for them, a cozy, comfortable farmhouse filled with love and laughter. Margaret, with her green thumb and her nurturing spirit, created a beautiful garden filled with flowers, vegetables, and herbs. She loved the feel of the soil on her hands, the satisfaction of watching things grow, of creating life. They adopted a dog, a scruffy terrier mix from a local shelter, who quickly became a beloved member of their family. They named him Chance, a reminder of the unlikely circumstances that had brought them together. They lived a quiet, unassuming life, far from the prying eyes of the press and the public. They were known in the village simply as Mr. and Mrs. Humphrey, a young couple starting a new life, building a future together. But their past was never far away. They received occasional visits from Evelyn Reed, who kept them informed of the ongoing war effort and the efforts to rebuild a shattered world. They also heard rumors of Clara, still fighting with the French resistance, her bravery and her resilience an inspiration to them both. One day, a letter arrived, bearing a French postmark. It was from Clara. She was alive and she was safe. She had survived the war, and she was working to help rebuild her country. Margaret and Henry were overjoyed to hear from her, to know that she was well. They wrote back immediately, sharing their news, their happiness, their hopes for the future. Years passed, and their lives settled into a comfortable rhythm. They raised a family, 2 children, a boy and a girl, who filled their home with laughter and love. They watched their children grow, teaching them the values of honesty, integrity, and compassion. They never forgot the sacrifices that had been made for them, the friends they had lost, the dangers they had faced. They honored the memory of those who had fallen, those who had fought for freedom, for justice, for a better world. As they grew older, they often reflected on their journey, the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. They had met in a time of war, in a world of chaos and uncertainty. They had faced betrayal, loss, and unimaginable danger. But through it all, their love had endured, their bond had strengthened. They had found each other, and they had found their way home. One evening, as they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the ocean, Henry turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with a deep and abiding love. "You know, Maggie," he said, his voice soft and gentle, "I never believed in fate. I never believed in destiny. But meeting you surviving all that we've been through, it makes me wonder." Margaret smiled, her hand reaching for his. "Perhaps there is some truth to it, Alastair," she said. "Perhaps we were meant to be together. Perhaps our paths were always destined to cross." They sat in silence for a moment, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that had spanned continents, overcome obstacles, and endured the test of time. The reckoning of hearts had been a long and arduous journey, a journey filled with pain, with loss, with sacrifice. But it had also been a journey of hope, of resilience, of unwavering love. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged into the light. They had found their happily ever after, a love forged in war, a love that would last in eternity. The final chapter of their extraordinary journey was not an ending, but a beginning, a testament to the enduring power of love, of hope, of the human spirit. They would continue on together. Always. Epilogue. Decades later, long after the war had ended and the world had moved on, an elderly Margaret sat on the porch of their Cornish farmhouse, a weathered photo album resting on her lap. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the familiar landscape, the same view she and Henry Alistair had shared for countless evenings. He was gone now, several years past, but his presence lingered in every corner of the farm, in every beat of her heart. Her fingers, gnarled with age, gently turned the pages of the album, each photograph a portal to a shared memory, a testament to a love that had defied the odds. There was Henry, a young soldier with a hopeful smile, before the world had weighed him down with secrets and betrayals. There they were, huddled together in a bombed-out church in New York, fear etched on their faces, their hands clasped tightly. A faded image of Clara, her defiant gaze staring out from the past, a reminder of a friendship forged in the crucible of war. She paused at a picture of their wedding day, a simple ceremony in a village church, their faces radiant with a joy that had seemed impossible just months before. The wildflowers in her hair had long since faded, but the love in Henry's eyes, captured in that single frame, remained as vibrant as ever. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel over their home, a tree they had planted together on their first anniversary, a symbol of their growing love, their enduring commitment. Its branches, now thick and strong, reached towards the sky, a testament to the passage of time, the resilience of life. Her grandchildren, now grown with families of their own, often asked about their story, about the war, about the great adventure that had brought their grandparents together. Margaret would tell them tales of courage, of sacrifice, of a love that had conquered all. She would speak of Henry's bravery, of Clara's unwavering loyalty, of Evelyn Reed's unwavering commitment to the truth. But she would always emphasize the simple, enduring power of love, the force that had guided them through the darkness, the light that had led them home. She closed the album, her heart filled with a bittersweet mixture of sorrow and gratitude. She missed Henry terribly, his gentle touch, his warm smile, the quiet companionship they had shared for so many years. But she was also grateful for the life they had built together, for the family they had raised, for the love that had sustained them through thick and thin. As the last rays of the sun faded below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Margaret felt a familiar presence beside her, a warmth that enveloped her like a comforting embrace. It was Henry, she knew, his spirit forever intertwined with hers, their love transcending the boundaries of time and space. She smiled, a single tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. She was not alone. She would never be alone. Their love story, a story forged in war, tempered by adversity, and sealed by an unwavering devotion, would live on, a legacy of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of the human heart. She whispered a silent promise to the twilight, a promise to remember, to cherish, to keep their love alive, until the day they were reunited, in a place where wars were forgotten and love reigned eternal. The farm, the fields, the ocean view, it was all a testament to their improbable, enduring love. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, she knew, with absolute certainty, that their story was not over. It was simply continued.